Hello everyone and thanks for joining me once again for this video. Today we will talk about web components, and when I talk about web components, I'm not talking about custom elements you can find in Bricks or in Oxygen or in Breakdance or any page builder. I'm talking about actual web components that bring completely custom functionalities to our custom-made HTML element. And you will see that we are able to create them right inside our page builder. And we will see how to do it both in Bricks and Oxygen, and you will see that it is very similar. But first, let's have a look at what we are talking about and what we are building. So this is the result. It can look very simple, and our actual web component is just there. This small little component here that is counting the words in the parent element. And I can modify the content. This has nothing to do with the web component. We will also see how to make a paragraph of text being editable. You will see that it's very easy. But then whenever I change my content, my custom web component is counting and printing the number of words in my content. Okay, so what does a web component look like? Let's open the DevTools. And here is our component. Actually, it's this element. Yeah. And if you are used to look at Bricks source code, you notice that this is a simple basic text element with a custom tag of P for a paragraph. But when we open it, we can see this shadow root, which is the clue that this is a custom web component. Because what happens here is that behind this simple paragraph of text, we are creating what we call a shadow DOM, which could be considered like another layer or a second level of DOM, meaning that our component has its own structure. So this one is very simple. We only created a span with a content that counts the words and updates it. But this could be a very complex structure if we needed to. And we can see that this is dynamic because if I modify my text, once again, we can see that the number of words is updating live. Okay, so how do we do this? You will see that it is quite simple. So let's start, for example, by creating a structure in Bricks, and we will do the same in Oxygen. So let's insert a section with a container. I will make my section full height, place elements in the center. In my container, I will add an H1. Let's add an article. My article will be a card 2. It will be a flex column, centered. Inside of it, let's add an H2, a first paragraph of text, a second paragraph of text, and a third paragraph of text. This is our web component, and this will be dummy texts. This one will be one paragraph, another paragraph, and the last one will be our element. So let's simply empty it. Okay, I will add some gap to my article and also some spacing. So my container will be a flex column also with a gap. Okay, so we are finished creating the structure. So maybe first thing, how to make this content editable? Well, that's very simple. We just select our article, go to the styles, attributes, and we will add an attribute with the name of content editable, lowercase, no space, and we can leave the value empty. And if I save this and check my front end, you can notice that I can modify the content of my element. So simply with this attribute, content editable, I can modify the content of the element. So very quickly, so we can catch up, let's create the same structure in Oxygen. So let's add a section, make our section full height, add an H1. This is our web component. My section will be a flex column with items centered. Let's add an article with the class of card2, an H2, a first paragraph, a second paragraph, and a third one. Expand all so you can see what's inside. Let's add dummy content, 3 words for the title, a paragraph, another paragraph. The last one, we want it empty. My article will be a flex column with items centered. It will have a gap of 4. And I noticed that I gave it the accent color. So let's keep the neutral one. Card 2, this one, perfect. And same thing as in Bricks. To make the content editable, let's pick the ID, go to the attributes and add an attribute of content editable. Let's save and check if everything is okay. We have our content and it is editable. Perfect. So we have our basic structure both in Bricks and in Oxygen, but for now, our third paragraph is completely empty and it is invisible. If we inspect the page, we will find it, but there's absolutely nothing inside of it. It's not expandable because there is no content at all. Okay, so now let's create our web component. And to do this, I will add a code block. And notice that my code block is at the end of my structure. Let's do the same thing in Bricks. So now we have a code element, both in Bricks and in Oxygen. So you probably know the code blocks behave a little differently. So if you are in Oxygen, we first go to our PHP and HTML and we will add a comment because we want nothing here. And we are interested in the JavaScript tab. In Bricks, things are a little different. So we will go to content. We will get rid of everything that's inside of it. And we will add a script tag and drop down in the middle. So we are now ready to start writing code. So notice that in Bricks, we need the script tags. In Oxygen, we don't need it. We directly write our code and Oxygen will take care of wrapping it in the script tag. And now we will write some JavaScript, but don't worry, if you are not familiar with JavaScript, we will go step by step and I will explain each step and what it is doing. So the first thing we want is to create a class, a JavaScript class. And to create a class, we use the keyword class and we give it a name of word count, for example. And there are two kinds of web components. The first category extends an existing HTML element, and the second category is a standalone one. It's an element made from scratch. What we will do today is the first type. We will extend an HTML element, which is our paragraph element, our p tag. So our class word count extends the HTML paragraph and take care of lower and uppercase letters because this matters. Element. Open and close curly brackets, and in the middle, let's drop down and we will define our class. And the first thing we will do inside of our class is create the constructor. The constructor is a function that will be executed when we create a new instance of our element. So for this, we use the keyword constructor, a pair of parentheses, and a pair of curly brackets for the body of our function. We drop down between the curly brackets and we will describe what we need to do. So the first thing we do in a constructor is to call super. And this is a specific function that will give us the characteristics of the parent element. By parent, in our case, we mean the extended element, which is the paragraph element. So now that this is done, we want to count the number of words in the parent element. And this time with the parent, I mean the parent in the page structure, which is our article element. And to be able to count the words in the parent element, we first need to get access to this element. So we will create a constant with the keyword const. We will call it parent element. And this is equal to this. In this context, the keyword this means our element instance. So it will be our word count element. So we want this element dot parent node. And so we store in this constant called parent element a handle to access the parent node, which is the article element. Now that we have access to the element, let's create a function. So we have several syntax for creating a function. Let's use a simple one. We will use function count words. And this function will take a node as a parameter, which is an element, a node, an element in our document. And with this node, open and close curly brackets, and in the middle, we will describe what this function does. So first, we will store the text. So we create a new constant text, and this will be equal to our node, and we look inside of it with dot, and we will look for the inner text. And sometimes, depending on the exact element, the inner text property may not exist. So we'll say, or with a double pipe, if node.innerText doesn't exist, look for node.textContent. Okay, so this will grab either the node.innerText or the node.textContent, depending on what is available with a priority. The first one, node.innerText. And now, with this text, we want to count the words. So we'll do a series, we'll give a series of instructions, because for now we have a bunch of text, of paragraphs, and we want to clean it to get the number of words. So I will slice it in several steps so we understand what is happening. First, so obviously in real code, we would do something much more compact, but for the purpose of the demonstration, I'll do something very detailed. First, we create a trimmed text, and this will be equal to our text. And our text is a string, and every string has access to a function that is trim, that we call with a pair of parentheses. And what this does is that it removes leading or trailing white space. So if we add space at the beginning of our text content or space at the end, it will be removed. So now we are sure that we have a text without leading or trailing white space. And we want to split this remaining text in individual words. So how to find words in a bunch of text? We are looking for space, for white space. And actually, we will take our big text and we will create an array with individual pieces of this big text being the array elements. And we want to create a new element each time that we find a white space. Okay, so let's say that our new const split text will be equal to our trimmed text dot, and we will use the split function. And now we need to tell it how to split this text. And for this, we will use a regular expression. So regular expressions can be a bit confusing. This is absolutely not a course about regular expression because there's a lot to say about it. But we will use a simple one. So to write a regular expression, first you use a pair of forward slash. The first one is the beginning of the regular expression. The second one is the end. Just after the second one, I will place a G for global, meaning that I want to search globally in my trim text. Without this G, it would stop at the first occurrence. So I want to find all of them. And what I want to find, and I will use a special token maybe, which will be a backslash s. So a backslash s on its own would be looking for individual space characters, and I will add a plus. So I'm looking for every white space with something behind. Okay, so if we look at a sentence, as we know that we have first trimmed our text, we have no leading or trailing white space. Well, if we read our sentence, each time we find a white space with something after it, it's a new word. Okay, so this function will read our text, and each time it finds a white space with something behind, it will create a new element in our array. The next step is that we want to clean false positives. For example, if we have two consecutive white space, I don't want it to count for two words. It's only one. So let's create a new const, and this one will be filtered text, and we will use our split text. And this time it's not a string anymore, it's an array. And arrays have access to a function called filter. And this function takes a function as a parameter. So let's drop down between the parentheses and define what happens. So we'll say that for each EL, for the element in my array, I want to return my element, and my element is a string because we have an array of string, individual words. So I want to trim my element to eliminate leading and trailing white space. And if there is something remaining after I've trimmed leading and trailing white space, it means that I have a word. Otherwise, I had just a series of consecutive white space. So I want to check for the length of the result and make sure that it is more than 0. Okay, so what we are doing here, we are taking our array, and for each individual element, we are returning true if the element has a length after we have removed leading and trailing white space. So we will keep only the array element that return true, so actual words. And finally, I want to return, because remember, back to the beginning of our function, we want to count words. So now that we have a filtered array with elements that are actual words, we want to return our filter text dot length. And this will be our number of words. The remaining elements in the filtered text array are only actual words. Perfect. So now that we have defined our function to count words, we want to create the string, the text string that will be displayed on our page in our element. So let's create a const that we will call, for example, result. And we will use for this a template literal. And template literals are very convenient ways to write string of text with dynamic data in JavaScript. So how to create a template literal? That's very simple. We use two backticks, one to begin and one to end, and I'll add a semicolon. And between my backticks, I can combine actual text and dynamic data. So let's start with static text. We will say words with a colon, and then we want to display dynamically the result. So to insert a dynamic variable, to insert the value of a variable in a template literal, we use $sign, a pair of curly brackets, and inside this pair of curly brackets, we can output dynamic data, and our dynamic data will be a call to our function, count words, parentheses, and remember, we give it a node as a parameter, and the node we want to give it is our parent element. Okay, so this will output a string with words and then the result of our function applied to the parent element. Okay, so we have everything ready. So now we can create the shadow DOM for our element. So how do we do this? Once again, we create a constant that we will call shadow, and this is equal to this. Remember, this refers to this instance of our count word class. and we will call the function attach shadow. And as a parameter, we will give it an object. So to define an object, we use a pair of curly brackets with a property of mode, and we will set this property to open. Perfect. So now we have a shadow DOM, which is a separate structure that is attached to our element. So we can now create an element. So let's say that our text is equal to, and we will use our document and calling a function that is create element. And what element do we want to create? We want to create a span. We could create anything, but this will be a span. Remember, it will go inside of our paragraph element. And now what will be the content of our newly created element? Because this is a shell, but there's nothing inside the shell yet. So we want to say that our text content is equal to our result. Okay, I hope you're still following me. We are nearly done. Now that we have our text with the content, what do we want to do? Well, we want to take our element with its content and attach it to our shadow DOM. So we will use our shadow that we created earlier, and we will append a child, and the child we want to append is our text element. Okay, so now our text is a child of our shadow. And finally, we want it to be dynamic. So we don't want to count the words only once when the page loads, but we want to count when something changes. So we will set an interval, which is a function. And this function takes a function as a parameter. So let's give it a blank one for now. And as a second parameter, it takes a time. Let's say that we want to check every 500 milliseconds, for example. And now what do? We simply recalculate our result and then apply it to our text content. And we are almost done. At least our class is finished. The last thing we want to do is to define our custom element, because now we have created a class, but it's standing alone somewhere in the air. So we want to tell our browser that it can use it whenever it's called in the document. And to do this, we will say that custom elements dot define, and this function will take three parameters. The first one will be a name for our custom element. Let's call it word-count. The second one is the class that describe our element. So this is our word count class. And the third element we want to give it is an object. And this object will take one property for us, telling that our custom element extends the P element. And now to use our custom element, we can do this with a custom attribute with the name of is applied to and only to P elements with a value of word count. So whenever the browser will parse the document object model and find a paragraph element with an attribute of is word count, it will know that this element must use the class that we just created. Okay, so we are done with it. I can apply code and we should see nothing in our browser. Obviously, I've done the typing in Oxygen, but we can just copy it and paste it inside of Bricks. So it's exactly as if you did write everything in Bricks. I will say that I want to execute code. I want to render without a wrapper. Let's save. Let's also make sure, so Oxygen is the opposite. By default, there is no wrap, so I don't need to uncheck without wrapper. I did apply. Let's save. And now that this is done, we need to go to our last paragraph and apply a custom attribute with the name is and the value of word count. That's saved. Let's do the same in bricks. Take my element. It has a tag of P. Make sure that it has a tag of P, otherwise it will not work. Add an attribute with the name is and the value of word count. And now, hopefully, let's check our front end. And that's nice. We have our word count appearing at the bottom of our article where there was nothing before. And if I modify my content, it dynamically modifies the value. Let's check if the same happens in Oxygen. And that's perfect. We also have our custom element or our newly created web component applied. And let's also make sure that it updates. And it does. And to finish, let's have a look at our dev tools. And we can see that we have our paragraph element. This time we are looking at the dev tools for Oxygen. It's a text block, so usually a simple P element with the text, but because it's our web component and Chrome did create the web component because it found the attribute of is word count on this specific P element, it did create the shadow DOM, it did attach our span element, and it updates its value dynamically. And this is how you create web components directly within your page builder. For this example, I used a code block directly inside of my structure, but you could write your JavaScript in an external JavaScript file and enqueue it in your website. This one was a very simple one, but I'm sure you can imagine that we can go for very, very complex web components using this technique. I hope you liked it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you liked it, press the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. This video was focused on code and JavaScript and creative web components, but you've seen that I, of course, also used OxyProps to build the structure. Thanks to it, we can have our structure ready very quickly. So if you don't use it yet, consider giving it a try. I wish you the best and I'll see you in the next video.